Early centuries of the Roman Republic, foundation of the Republic. The ancient historians depicted Rome's first 6 kings as benevolent and just rulers, but the last one as a cruel tyrant who murdered his predecessor Servius Tullius, usurped the kingship, terrorized the Senate, and oppressed the common people with public works. He supposedly was overthrown by a popular uprising ignited by the rape of a virtuous noblewoman, Lucretia, by the king's son. The reign of Tarquinius Superbus was described in the stereotypical terms of a Greek tyranny in order to explain the major political transition from the monarchy to the republic in accordance with Greek political theory concerning constitutional evolution from monarchy to tyranny to aristocracy. This explanation provided later Romans with a satisfying patriotic story of despotism giving way to liberty. It is probably unhistorical, however, and merely a Roman adaptation of a well-known Greek story of a love affair in Athens that led to the murder of the tyrant's brother and the tyrant's eventual downfall. According to ancient tradition, as soon as the Romans had expelled their last, tyrannical king, Rome was attacked and besieged by the king of the Etruscan city of Clusium, Lars Porsena. The city was gallantly defended by Horatius Cocles, who sacrificed his life in defense of the bridge across the Tiber, and Mucius Scaevola, who attempted to assassinate Porsena in his own camp. When arrested before accomplishing the deed, he demonstrated his courage by voluntarily burning off his right hand in a nearby fire. As a result of such Roman heroism, Porsena was supposed to have made peace with Rome and withdrawn his army. One prevalent modern view is that the monarchy at Rome was incidentally terminated through military defeat and foreign intervention. This theory sees Rome as a site highly prized by the Etruscans of the 6th century BC, who are known to have extended their power and influence at the time across the Tiber into Latium and even farther south into Campania. Toward the end of the 6th century, Rome may have been involved in a war against King Porsena of Clusium, who defeated the Romans, seized the city, and expelled its last king. Before Porsena could establish himself as monarch, he was forced to withdraw, leaving Rome kingless. In fact, Porsena is known to have suffered a serious defeat at the hands of the combined forces of the other Latins and the Greeks of Campanian Cumae. Rather than restoring Tarquin from exile to power, the Romans replaced the kingship with 2 annually elected magistrates, originally called praetors, later consuls. The struggle of the orders. As the Roman state grew in size and power during the early Republic, 509 to 280 BC, new offices and institutions were created, and old ones were adapted to cope with the changing military, political, social, and economic needs of the state and its populace. According to the annalistic tradition, all these changes and innovations resulted from a political struggle between 2 social orders, the patricians and the plebeians, that is thought to have begun during the first years of the Republic and lasted for more than 200 years. In the beginning, the patricians were supposed to have enjoyed a monopoly of power, the consulship, the Senate, and all religious offices, whereas the plebeians began with nothing except the right to vote in the assemblies. During the course of the struggle, the plebeians, however, were believed to have won concessions gradually from the patricians through political agitation and confrontation, and they eventually attained legal equality with them. Thus ancient historians, such as Livy, explained all aspects of early Rome's internal political development in terms of a single sustained social movement. As tradition has it, the distinction between patricians and plebeians was as old as Rome itself and had been instituted by Romulus. The actual historical dating and explanation of this distinction still constitutes the single biggest unsolved problem of early Roman history. The distinction existed during the Middle and Late Republic, but modern scholars do not agree on when or how it arose. They are increasingly inclined to think that it originated and evolved slowly during the early Republic. By the time of the Middle and Late Republic, it was largely meaningless. At that point, only about 12 Roman families were patrician, all others being plebeian. Both patrician and plebeian families made up the nobility, which consisted simply of all descendants of consuls. The term patrician, therefore, was not synonymous with noble and should not be confused with it. The patricians formed only a part of the Roman nobility of the Middle and Late Republic. The only difference between patricians and plebeians in later times was that each group was either entitled to or debarred from holding certain minor offices. The discrepancies, inconsistencies, and logical fallacies in Livy's account of the early republic make it evident that the annalistic tradition's thesis of a struggle of the orders is a gross oversimplification of a highly complex series of events that had no single cause. Tensions certainly existed. No state can experience 200 years of history without some degree of social conflict and economic unrest. In fact, legal sources indicate that the law of debt in early Rome was extremely harsh and must have sometimes created much hardship. Yet it is impossible to believe that all aspects of early Rome's internal political development resulted from one cause. Early documents, if available, would have told the later annalistic historians little more than that a certain office had been created or some law passed. An explanation of causality could have been supplied only by folklore or by the imagination of the historian himself, neither of which can be relied upon. Livy's descriptions of early Republican political crises evince the political rhetoric and tactics of the late Republic and therefore cannot be given credence without justification. For example, early Republican agrarian legislation is narrated in late Republican terms. Early Republican conflicts between plebeian tribunes and the Senate are likewise patterned after the politics of the optimates and populares of the late Republic. Caution therefore must be exercised in examining early Rome's internal development. Many of the major innovations recorded in the ancient tradition can be accepted, but the ancient interpretation of these facts cannot go unchallenged. The consulship. The later Romans viewed the abolition of the kingship and its replacement by the consulship as marking the beginning of the republic. The king's religious functions were henceforth performed by a priest-king, rex sacrorum, who held office for life. The king's military power, imperium, was bestowed upon two annually elected magistrates called consuls. They were always regarded as the chief magistrates of the republic, so much so that the names of each pair were given to their year of office for purposes of dating. Thus careful records were kept of these names, which later formed the chronological basis for ancient histories of the republic. The consuls were primarily generals who led Rome's armies in war. They were therefore elected by the centuriate assembly, that is, the Roman army organized into a voting body. The two consuls possessed equal power. Such collegiality was basic to almost all Roman public offices. It served to check abuses of power because one magistrate's actions could be obstructed by his colleague. According to the annalistic tradition, the first plebeian consul was elected for 366 BC. All consuls before that time were thought to have been patrician, and one major aspect of the struggle of the orders was supposed to have been the plebeians' persistent agitation to make the office open to them. However, if the classification of patrician and plebeian names known for the Middle and Late Republic is applied to the consular list for the years 509 to 445 BC, plebeian names are well represented, 30%. It is likely that there never was a prohibition against plebeians holding the consulship. The distinction between patrician and plebeian families may have become fixed only by the middle of the 4th century BC. And the law of that time, 367 BC, which specified that one of the consuls was to be plebeian, may have done nothing more than to guarantee legally that both groups of the nobility would have an equal share in the state's highest office. The dictatorship, despite the advantages of consular collegiality, in military emergencies unity of command was sometimes necessary. Rome's solution to this problem was the appointment of a dictator in place of the consuls. According to ancient tradition, the office of dictator was created in 501 BC, and it was used periodically down to the Second Punic War. The dictator held supreme military command for no longer than 6 months. He was also termed the master of the army, magister populi. And he appointed a subordinate cavalry commander, the master of horse, magister equitum. The office was thoroughly constitutional and should not be confused with the late republican dictatorships of Sulla and Caesar, which were simply legalizations of autocratic power obtained through military usurpation. The Senate of ancient Rome. The Senate may have existed under the monarchy and served as an advisory council for the king. Its name suggests that it was originally composed of elderly men, senas, whose age and knowledge of traditions must have been highly valued in a preliterate society. During the Republic, the Senate was composed of members from the leading families. Its size during the early Republic is unknown. Ancient sources indicate that it numbered about 300 during the Middle Republic. Its members were collectively termed patres et conscripti, the fathers and the enrolled, suggesting that the Senate was initially composed of two different groups. Since the term patrician was derived from patres and seems to have originally meant a member of the patres, the dichotomy probably somehow involved the distinction between patricians and plebeians. During the Republic, the Senate advised both magistrates and the Roman people. Although in theory the people were sovereign, see below, and the Senate only offered advice, in actual practice the Senate wielded enormous power because of the collective prestige of its members. It was by far the most important deliberative body in the Roman state, summoned into session by a magistrate who submitted matters to it for discussion and debate. Whatever a majority voted in favor of was termed the Senate's advice, Senatus Consultum. These advisory decrees were directed to a magistrate or the Roman people. In most instances, they were either implemented by a magistrate or submitted by him to the people for enactment into law. The popular assemblies. During the Republic, two different assemblies elected magistrates, exercised legislative power, and made other important decisions. Only adult male Roman citizens could attend the assemblies in Rome and exercise the right to vote. The assemblies were organized according to the principle of the group vote. Although each person cast one vote, he did so within a larger voting unit. The majority vote of the unit became its vote, and a majority of unit votes was needed to decide an issue. The Centuriate Assembly, Comitia Centuriata, as stated, was military in nature and composed of voting groups called centuries, military units. Because of its military character, it always met outside the sacred boundary of the city, Pomerium, in the field of Mars, Campus Martius. It voted on war and peace and elected all magistrates who exercised imperium, consuls, praetors, censors, and curule aediles. Before the creation of criminal courts during the late Republic, it sat as a high court and exercised capital jurisdiction. Although it could legislate, this function was usually performed by the tribal assembly. The Centuriate Assembly evolved through different stages during the early Republic, but information exists only about its final organization. It may have begun as the citizen army meeting under arms to elect its commander and to decide on war or peace. During historical times, the assembly had a complex organization. All voting citizens were placed into one of 5 economic classes according to wealth. Each class was allotted varying numbers of centuries, and the entire assembly consisted of 193 units. The first, and richest, class of citizens was distributed among 80 centuries, and the second, the third, and fourth classes were each assigned 20 units. The fifth class, comprising the poorest persons in the army, was allotted 30 centuries. In addition, there were 18 centuries of knights, men wealthy enough to afford a horse for cavalry service, and 5 other centuries, one of which comprised the proletarii, or landless people too poor to serve in the army. The knights voted together with the first class, and voting proceeded from richest to poorest. Because the knights and the first class controlled 98 units, they were the dominant group in the assembly, though they constituted the smallest portion of the citizen body. The assembly was deliberately designed to give the greater authority to the wealthier element and was responsible for maintaining the political supremacy of the established nobility. The tribal assembly, Comitia Tributa, was a non-military civilian assembly. It accordingly met within the city inside the Pomerium and elected magistrates who did not exercise imperium, plebeian tribunes, plebeian aediles, and quaestors. It did most of the legislating and sat as a court for serious public offenses involving monetary fines. The tribal assembly was more democratic in its organization than the centuriate assembly. The territory of the Roman state was divided into geographic districts called tribes, and people voted in these units according to residence. The city was divided into 4 urban tribes. During the 5th century BC, the surrounding countryside formed 17 rustic tribes. With the expansion of Roman territory in central Italy, 387 to 241 BC, 14 rustic tribes were added, thus gradually increasing the assembly to 35 units, a number never exceeded.